You are kneeling in a chamber where the air is too still. The smell is of damp stone and iron, sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. A strip of linen has been wound across your eyes, and you feel the weight of it pressing down, heavy not for what it hides, but for what it makes inevitable. Your wrists are bound with cord that bites into the skin, and every small twitch sends fire along your arms. You are not old enough to understand the full language of men, yet your body knows what it means to be surrounded by silence, broken only by the faint rattle of metal placed on a low table. You are pulled forward by rough hands, your knees sliding across stone polished by many before you. The ground is slick in places, with a cold wetness that clings to your skin. The linen is torn away, and the sudden light of torches burns your eyes. You blink and shapes resolve. A circle of men, robed and solemn, their shadows stretching up the walls like tall spectres. None of them meet your gaze, and in their silence lies the cruelest answer. You are not here as a boy, you are here as material. The table holds instruments that gleam dully in the firelight, each one sharpened to a point or curved to cut. Beside them rests a basin half filled with water that is already stained. The man nearest you adjusts his robe, leans forward, and sets his hand upon your shoulder. His touch is not violent, but final. His words are few. You do not recognize their meaning, only their tone, which closes all paths of escape. You think of the hills where you were taken, the sound of your mother's voice carried by wind through the trees. You remember your father's hands as he tried to push you into hiding, the sudden shouting, the clash of steel, the weight of men pulling you away. That was not long ago. It feels like another life. You are lowered back, your body pressed against cold stone, and your small fists clench though there is nothing left to hold. The torchlight wavers above you, the blade is lifted. The sound is a breath away. No hope, no escape. Only the certainty that what is taken now will never return, and that your life has already been bent into a shape you did not choose. The chamber holds many like you. Some have not yet woken from their silence. Some never will. The cycle does not stop. You feel it pressing down, heavier than the cord, heavier than the linen, heavier than the hand on your shoulder. It is the weight of a system, older and stronger than you. But before we continue, if you enjoy dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing and comment where you are watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like this. Now, back to the video. In the 17th century, Persia was ruled by the Safavid dynasty, a house that bound its power to religion, ceremony, and the architecture of fear. The empire stretched across lands rich in silk, carpets, and precious metals, and at its heart stood Isfahan, a capital of domes, palaces, and markets whose beauty masked the machinery that sustained it. Behind the turquoise tiles and wide boulevards was a state that relied on violence not only to defend its borders, but to shape the lives of those within. The Safavids were Shia Muslims, guardians of an identity that separated them from their Sunni rivals in the Ottoman world and beyond. Faith was weapon and shield, and it justified practices that left generations scarred. The court of the Shah was a place of ceremony and spectacle. Music, poetry, and gardens gave an impression of refinement, yet each performance rested on hidden cruelties. In the private chambers of the palace, young bodies were taken, reshaped, and presented as instruments of pleasure and control. Eunuchs were not merely servants, they were symbols of submission, proof that the Shah could bend enemies into tools. Their presence reminded courtiers that the ruler's power extended even into the most intimate parts of human life. Castrated boys filled the roles of guardians, intermediaries, and concubines. They were trophies of conquest, their altered bodies, silent records of raids across the Caucasus. Georgia lay on the empire's northern frontier, a mountainous land repeatedly raided by Safavid forces. Families were torn apart, villages emptied, and boys carried south across mountain passes into a world they had never seen. Their fate was sealed not in battle, but in what followed. In markets and barracks they were separated, inspected, and chosen for different paths. Some were sold as slaves, some forced into military service, and a select few were directed toward the palace, where their youth and appearance determined a more intimate role. In Safavid Persia, beauty was not a blessing but a sentence. The castration of these boys was not an act of private cruelty, but a state-sanctioned practice. Surgeons, often themselves captives who had learned through brutal apprenticeship, carried out the procedure with a mixture of ritual and pragmatism. The survival rate was low, yet the court demanded more, and so raids continued. Each body that survived the operation became a valuable asset. Eunuchs, unable to sire families, were considered trustworthy by rulers who feared betrayal from bloodlines. Their voices, high and unbroken, lent an eerie sound to the music of court life. Their presence blurred lines between servant and ornament, guardian and captive. They were both within the system and eternally excluded from it. This was the world of Safavid Persia, a fusion of faith, conquest, and spectacle, where the destruction of boys became routine. It was not hidden in shadow, but normalized, woven into the empire's display of power. The Shah's authority was affirmed not only by armies and mosques, but by the silent figures who stood behind him, their lives erased and rewritten for the glory of the court. The boys were often no older than 10 or 12 when they were taken. Their first memories of Persia were not of gardens or bazaars, but of enclosure. They were herded into holding quarters where the air was thick with sweat and fear, their voices swallowed in a language they did not understand. The journey south from Georgia had stripped them of names. They were numbers, bodies counted and reassigned. In the hands of palace officials, the children were sorted, and some were marked for a fate that even they could not yet grasp. The operation itself was a threshold. For those who survived, the pain was only the beginning. Recovery was long and uncertain, and many were left with fever, infection, or permanent injury. The boys who lived awoke in a world where their bodies no longer belonged to them. Their voices remained high, their growth arrested. Mirrors reflected figures that no longer resembled their fathers or brothers. For some, the shame was worse than the wound. Each boy became a possession of the palace. Some were dressed in fine garments, fabrics of silk dyed in deep blues and reds. Their outward beauty was displayed, yet it only underscored their captivity. They served in chambers lit by oil lamps, carrying water, guarding doors, and waiting on men whose authority was absolute. Others were reserved for private duties, their bodies turned into instruments of the Shah's pleasure. Every gesture, every smile, every word was measured against the will of the master. One boy, taken from a mountain village near Tbilisi, had once known the sound of bells from a small church. In the palace, those memories became distant fragments, too fragile to speak aloud. He learned to move quietly, to keep his head lowered, to accept the touch of hands that summoned him. Nights stretched long, with laughter in one chamber and muffled cries in another. He grew older in body, but was never allowed to become a man. For many victims, the greatest cruelty was the severing of lineage. They could not return home as sons or fathers. Even if escape were possible, what awaited them? Families destroyed, villages burned, identities erased. The eunuchs of the court became a class apart, bound together by shared loss yet divided by their roles. Some gained influence as confidants of the Shah, their words carrying weight in politics. Others lived and died unnoticed, their names never recorded. In the silence of their quarters, they carried unspoken grief. Their songs, when they sang, had a strange high pitch that echoed through the corridors of Isfahan. Their laughter, when it came, was brittle. Each boy carried a story that could not be told openly, because to speak of it would mean defiance, and defiance meant disappearance. The palace walls were high, and within them, the victims endured. Their existence at once visible and invisible. These were the lives broken and remade. Not by accident, but by design. What happened to the boys was not random cruelty. It was organized, managed, and sustained by the state. Safavid Persia relied on structures that turned violence into administration and suffering into a resource. Behind every child taken from the Caucasus stood a network of soldiers, merchants, surgeons, and officials who each played their part. Raids into Georgia and other borderlands were not isolated acts of plunder. They were systematic campaigns carried out under the banner of loyalty to the Shah. Captives were counted, divided, and taxed. Soldiers received their share, commanders claimed their due, and the remainder was sent south as tribute. Caravans of children crossed mountains and rivers under guard, and each step was recorded in ledgers kept by state clerks. The boys were never seen as individuals. They were entries in accounts, commodities valued for what could be extracted from them. Once inside Persia, the machinery of selection began. Some captives were sold in bazaars, others sent into labor, and the youngest and most physically suitable were delivered to the palace. The court maintained its own physicians, who oversaw the procedures of castration. They did not speak of morality or faith. They spoke of survival rates, costs, and efficiency. Every failed operation was a loss of profit. Every survivor was a success. The system refined itself over time, brutal yet precise. Eunuchs were not only used as concubines, they became indispensable within the administrative core of the empire. Because they could have no heirs, they were considered safe to trust with access to the Shah's most intimate spaces. They guarded harems, managed communications, and even advised on matters of policy. Some rose to remarkable influence, their loyalty secured not by choice but by design. The Shah surrounded himself with those whose lives had been broken to ensure his own security. Markets adjusted to meet demand. Slave traders understood the preferences of the court. A boy with a certain complexion or voice carried a higher price. A healthy survivor of the operation became more valuable than gold. Surgeons were paid well for their work, even though most of their patients died. The flow of bodies never ceased, because new raids supplied replacements. The system was sustained not only by violence but by repetition, until what was once shocking became ordinary. Religion offered justification. The Safavid state presented itself as defender of the Shia faith, but faith was flexible when it served power. Captives from Christian Georgia were outsiders, their suffering considered acceptable within the framework of conquest. By stripping them of manhood, the Shah turned enemies into symbols of submission. Their presence in the palace was not hidden but displayed. Each eunuch was a silent proclamation of the empire's reach and authority. The system endured because it was profitable, practical, and legitimized by both politics and faith. Cruelty was not the failure of Safavid governance, it was its method. What began as raids and isolated acts hardened into a tradition repeated across generations. The Safavid state inherited not only wealth and territory, but also the machinery of enslavement that earlier dynasties had practiced. By the 17th century, the cycle was complete. Soldiers rode north into Georgian valleys, tore children from homes, and sent them south. Surgeons cut, the palace absorbed, time passed, and then the process began again. Each raid seeded another generation of eunuchs. Each operation reinforced the role they played at court. Boys became men who could never become fathers. They served until death, their bodies reminders of what power could take and what it could shape. Their silence was not accidental. It was cultivated, passed on through example. New captives saw the older eunuchs, dressed in silks, moving quietly through corridors. They learned how to obey. They learned how to survive. Trauma became a school. The Shahs relied on this cycle because it created a renewable class of servants entirely dependent on the court. Unlike noble families, eunuchs could not build dynasties of their own. Unlike free men, they had no outside loyalties. Their lives were bound to the ruler alone. And so each generation of victims strengthened the throne of the Safavids, not by choice, but by absence of choice. Their brokenness became the architecture of royal stability. Within the palace, traditions grew around them. Eunuchs held keys to private chambers, carried messages, and enforced silence. They were trusted with secrets that could ruin reputations or topple alliances. Over decades, some amassed wealth and influence, but always within the limits of their condition. Their power came not from freedom, but from dependency. Their existence normalized the violence that created them, because their presence was constant, unremarked, and expected. Beyond the palace walls, families in Georgia and the Caucasus lived under the shadow of raids. Parents knew that sons might be taken, and each season of warfare reopened wounds. Communities carried the memory of loss, telling stories of boys who vanished and never returned. The trauma was not only personal, it was cultural. Whole regions were marked by the knowledge that youth could be stolen and remade in a distant court. Fear became part of identity, passed from one generation to the next. Even as Shahs changed and dynasties shifted, the practice endured. The machinery of violence proved resilient, adapting to new rulers and new needs. Eunuchs were not temporary anomalies but permanent fixtures. Their very visibility in the court made the system appear timeless, as though it had always been this way and could be no other. The cycle of seizure, mutilation, and service continued until it was no longer questioned. The tradition outlived the children it consumed. When the Safavid dynasty finally fell in the early 18th century, the palaces of Isfahan did not echo with the laughter of liberated servants. The eunuchs remained, bound not by the Shah's command but by the destruction already carved into their bodies. They had no villages to return to, no families to embrace them. They lingered in corners of the empire, as relics of a system that had used them up and left them behind. The long-term consequences reached far beyond individual lives. In Georgia, centuries of raids left whole communities scarred. Families lived with absence, generation after generation. Songs and laments told of children taken away, their voices extinguished in foreign courts. Mothers carried grief into old age. Fathers spoke of vengeance they could not achieve. A cultural memory formed, heavy with loss, that shaped identity long after the raids ended. In Persia, the legacy took a different shape. The eunuchs had been absorbed so deeply into the fabric of the palace that their presence outlasted the dynasty itself. Even as rulers changed, their roles lingered as symbols of how normalized cruelty had become. Later courts across the region inherited not just architecture and traditions, but the memory of these silent figures who guarded doors and kept secrets. The suffering of boys had become part of the logic of governance, a precedent that cruelty could be rationalized if it secured power. The social silence was perhaps the most chilling consequence. There was no open mourning for the children lost, no public ritual to acknowledge their suffering. Their pain was buried within palace walls, unseen except by those who benefited from it. In official records, they appear as property, as administrators, as servants, but rarely as people. The archive itself conspires in their erasure. What remains are fragments, hints of voices that once sang in a higher pitch than nature intended, or shadows cast on walls of painted halls. This silence extends into the present. Modern narratives of empire often celebrate architecture, art, and political achievements, while the lives consumed by these systems are brushed aside. The turquoise domes of Isfahan still gleam, drawing the eye upward, while the suffering that funded them lies unspoken beneath the stone. The beauty endures. The memory of cruelty fades unless deliberately recalled. Yet history has a way of whispering through absence. In the quiet of ruins, in the broken records of court life, the outline of those taken boys can still be traced. Their lives remind us that power often builds itself not on triumphs of culture, but on the silent destruction of the vulnerable. The Safavid Empire is gone, but the shadow it cast remains, lingering in the knowledge of what was once normalized. No loud condemnation is needed. The truth itself is enough. The empire of turquoise and silk was also an empire of broken bodies, and the silence of those boys is its most enduring monument. You walk through the ruins of Isfahan's palaces. The mosaics still gleam in fragments, their colors softened by centuries of dust. Arches rise into empty air, once filled with the murmur of courtiers and the laughter of rulers who believed their empire would never end. The stones hold echoes, not of kings, but of those who served them in silence. If you listen, you can almost hear the faint sound of high voices, boys who never grew into men, singing in tones that were not natural but forced. Their songs were woven into ceremonies, into the daily rhythm of court life, and yet their names were not preserved. They were treated as tools, and tools are not remembered. But their presence is everywhere, behind the tiled walls, behind the guarded doors, behind the splendor that dazzled visiting ambassadors. The cruelty did not vanish with the dynasty. It lived on as memory in Georgia, where villages told stories of sons taken and never returned. It lived on in the bureaucracy of later courts, where eunuchs remained a fixture, their existence both useful and tragic. The cycle had ended, but the mark it left was permanent. What is most haunting is not the violence itself, but the way it became ordinary. The raids were seasonal, the operations were routine, the service was expected. At no point did the system pause to question what was being done. Trauma became policy. Suffering became infrastructure. And in that normalization lies the truest horror. Centuries later, the turquoise domes still draw visitors who marvel at Safavid architecture. They walk through gardens designed to mirror paradise. They speak of poetry, calligraphy, and the flowering of Persian culture. Few speak of the boys who guarded those gardens, who poured water into fountains, who endured nights in hidden chambers. Their silence remains, as though the world has agreed to forget. But history does not forget. It leaves fragments scattered like broken tiles, waiting to be pieced together. Each fragment reveals the same truth, that empires are not only built by kings, but also by those crushed beneath their weight. The eunuchs of Safavid Persia remind us of the cost of splendor, a cost measured not in gold or stone, but in bodies altered and lives erased. You stand in the ruins, the light shifting across carved stone. No sound remains but the wind, yet in that silence is a reminder. Power fades, beauty decays, but the memory of cruelty lingers. It waits for someone willing to see it, to name it, to give shape to what was taken. The Safavid Empire is gone. The boys remain only as shadows. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson, that the greatest monuments are not the domes that still glitter, but the absences that cannot be filled. History often records the deeds of rulers with precision. The Shahs of Safavid Persia are remembered for their mosques, their armies, their patronage of art. But the lives of the boys who served them are almost invisible, erased by the same machinery that consumed them. They appear only in fragments, a name in a ledger, a passing remark in a traveler's account, a shadow in the background of a painting. What remains is absence, and in that absence lies their true legacy. The eunuchs of Persia remind us that history is not only the story of what was built, but also of what was broken. The turquoise domes and palaces of Isfahan stand as proof of cultural triumph, yet beneath their foundations are lives mutilated to sustain the image of grandeur. The empire's beauty and cruelty are inseparable. To admire one without acknowledging the other is to look only at half the truth. This silence has persisted for centuries. In the Caucasus, families pass down stories of sons taken away, shaping a cultural memory steeped in grief. In Persia, the eunuchs became so normalized that later generations rarely questioned their presence. They were fixtures of the court, like walls or gates, too common to be remarked upon. Their suffering became invisible through repetition. Even today, their legacy lingers in ways both subtle and disturbing. The idea that people can be reshaped into instruments of power, that bodies can be controlled and silenced for the sake of order, did not vanish with the fall of the Safavids. It reappears in different forms, in different empires, in every system that places control above humanity. The echoes are not confined to the 17th century. They are with us still. And yet, to speak of them now is to resist that silence. To trace their outline in history is to return some measure of voice to those who were forced into muteness. Their legacy is not only one of suffering, it is also one of endurance. Though their names are forgotten, the very fact that we can still uncover their presence shows that cruelty does not erase humanity entirely. Memory survives, even in fragments. You might stand today in the square of Isfahan, surrounded by beauty that has endured 4 centuries. Tourists take photographs, scholars write of architecture, and locals walk beneath the same arches their ancestors once knew. If you pause, if you look carefully, you might notice the silence behind the spectacle. That silence belongs to the boys who once guarded these doors, who once lit these lamps, who once lived and died unseen. Their legacy is not carved in stone. It is carved in the void they left behind. To acknowledge that void is to see the empire as it truly was. Magnificent, fragile, and built on lives that were never meant to be remembered. You are standing in the dusk of an empire long gone. The sun lowers across Isfahan's vast square, gilding minarets and domes in fading light. The call to prayer rises, just as it once did in the 17th century. Crowds flow through the same streets, unaware of the lives once bound to these stones. And you remain still, listening for voices that no longer speak. The eunuchs of Safavid Persia have no graves marked with names. No chronicles preserve their stories in detail. What survives is the architecture of the state that consumed them, and the fragments of records that treated them as property. Yet absence is not nothing. Absence weighs. It presses on the memory of places, bending history towards silence. The boys who were taken, cut, and reshaped into servants of a foreign king are not lost entirely. Their memory is scattered, faint, but persistent. When we speak of empire, we often speak of conquest, art, and monuments. But empires are also built upon hidden foundations of suffering. The Safavid court dazzled with silk, poetry, and ceremony. Behind it stood corridors filled with shadows of children who never grew into men. Their voices were used to praise rulers who destroyed them. Their bodies became symbols of power they could not share. This is the truth that remains when beauty is stripped of ornament. History teaches us not only what was done, but how easily cruelty becomes ordinary. Raids turned into rituals. Operations became procedure. Service became tradition. No one questioned. Few resisted. The system endured precisely because it felt unremarkable to those who benefited from it. That is the lesson most haunting, that the greatest atrocities do not always arrive as spectacles of horror, but as practices accepted and repeated until they are invisible. Centuries later, the turquoise domes still stand, admired by those who travel far to see them. They shine in guidebooks, in photographs, in memory. Yet the true monument of Safavid Persia is not in stone. It is in silence. The silence of boys taken from their homes, broken in body, and erased from history. To stand in Isfahan today is to walk among that silence, whether we acknowledge it or not. The weight of memory is heavy, but necessary. To carry it is to resist forgetting. To name what was done is to restore some measure of dignity to those who could not speak for themselves. Their suffering should not be reduced to a footnote, nor should it vanish beneath the beauty of an empire's ruins. You are kneeling on cold stone. The torches burn, the shadows move. And though centuries have passed, the silence of those boys endures. It asks nothing but to be remembered.